Good morning from a gloriously sunny UK. Hope you're having as nice weather as we are here. I'm going to go through this presentation it should take about 15 to 20 minutes. If you're logged into Google, you can interact through the chat facility. If not, you're welcome to send us an email with any questions and or comments. I guess probably the best email address to use would be info@mobilemarketdevelopment.com, and we'd be very happy to interact with you and discuss any points raised or anything else for that matter. Right. So this is just a terms and conditions slide, so I won't go on quickly that, but just to say that this presentation is a summary of two larger reports that appear on our Maximising Wireless Profit programme, which if you look at mobilemarketdevelopment.com, you can find we've got one report that deals with financial and technical issues and one report that deals with use cases. So this is a mash together of some of the key points from those presentations, and is a quick tour through, so more detail is available if you want it. There's a lot of commitment from the operator community in the area of 5G and a lot of trials going on. As it says on this slide, according to Viavi Solutions, there are 113 operators in 56 countries that have started or are considering 5G trials, and some of them are laid out there. At the moment, the number of trials, field trials, are split fairly evenly between the Americas, Europe, Middle East and Africa, and the Asia Pacific region. But you can see from the intended trials that there's a bit more momentum growing in the EMEA and APAC areas, as the lab trials and announcements are significantly higher. But it might be that the smaller number of players with higher penetrations mean that there's less new stuff to do in the Americas. So there may not, it may not represent a passing of the initiative. Again, I'll just go through this fairly quickly, just to say that a lot of the 5G use cases require further technology development. For example, ultra reliable low latency design, just to pick one at random. Nobody wants to be sitting in a car or even near a car, an autonomous vehicle, if it has latency problems because it's driven off the cliff by the time it's decided that it's recognized the cliff or hit the pedestrian or whatever. So there are definite requirements for technology, and they're quite broad, and they are expensive to meet the needs of. So it's not going to be it's not just a slam dunk easy evolution from 4G to 5G. There's a lot to do. And the problem is that the capital cost of doing all these things is much in excess of what the operators are looking at for a return. So for example, the GSMA estimates mobile revenue growth at 2.5% a year between 2020 and 2025, and that won't provide sufficient return on 5G investment required prior to 2020. So the global mobile revenues will pass something like just under €1 trillion by 2025, and in the US those revenues will be fairly flat, although the US will remain the largest single market. So there's a lot of money required to make this happen, and it's quite difficult to see where the money is going to come from, and in terms of operator revenues. And under those circumstances, it's going to be very difficult to find people to fund that development, the technology development that we've already hinted at, and the deployment, which is huge. So if you do know somebody that's willing to fund that sort of risk, then please pass their details on to us, because I've got some very good ideas how we could spend some of that sort of money. This just rams home the point that there's not going to be a huge amount of 5G specific revenue in the early years as 4G continues to grow as a proportion of the total sort of connectivity profile. So there is value, according to Accenture, over 400 billion euros will be added to the US GDP by 5G. But how much of that, excuse me, sod's law. Yes, sorry. So we will end up with around about a little over $1 trillion 5G enabled digitalization revenues for ICT players, which includes the mobile operators, but is much broader than that, according to Ericsson and Arthur D. Little. I'll come back to that number a bit later on. But that increase in value is roughly equivalent to the total mobile industry that exists at the moment. So it's quite there's a lot of money there. The question is how much the operator is going to get. And the problem is that it's quite chicken and egg. The technology is needed to deliver applications, which again I'll come back to. The demand for these applications is not fully clear until they're available, but the investment to develop and deploy the technology is difficult to find before the demand is clear. So a classic chicken and egg situation. Now, in previous generations, you could say the same when mobile networks were first rolled out. And I think there was a certain amount of risk involved in those early investments, but that was offset by regulators and governments providing long licenses and relatively, well, fairly limited competition, maybe a couple of players, maybe 3 in some cases. But this enabled investors to see, okay, there's a reason to take a chance and roll out a lot of network. The OTT players have rather spoilt that particular scenario because as 4G comes along, they just take all the revenues and leave the network operators finding it difficult to repay their investments. So this is a challenge, and selecting the areas that you're going to exploit for 5G is difficult, to say the least. You need to be able to identify applications where there will be operator revenues rather than somebody else's revenues if you're going to spend money on a network. I mentioned the pie in terms of increased revenues, the digitalization benefit, if you like, and it is a big pie. It's just that the slice for the network operators might be quite small. Our view is that regulators are unlikely to guarantee that share. They're not going to legislate that OTT providers provide revenues or subsidies or whatever. And without regulation, I don't think digital companies are likely to pay network operators for use of infrastructure which their customers are already paying for. So it's all part of the chicken and egg situation. And a number of ways have been looked at trying to sort of segment the application opportunities and so on in a way to identify where the opportunities might be. So, for example, segmenting by market and potential 5G relevance is the way that Who Are We has gone for it. And I'm sorry, the writing on this slide is a little small, but there are specific areas there where clearly there will be a lot of relevance for 5G and a lot of market opportunity. So smart manufacturing, connected automotive, all those sorts of things, cloud, virtual and augmented reality. These are all applications that are clearly going to be 5G use cases. What it doesn't say is, what does the operator get out of those? If you look at connected automotive, Ford and General Motors have got BMW and others have got a big vested interest in being the the players that are associated with connected automotive, and they may have more credentials to be selling customers to end users than telcos. So the idea is to find opportunity areas where there is growth and there is a rising tide, and there is an old saying that a rising tide floats all boats. That's as long as they're not tied to the side of the dock or whatever, in which case they sink. But there are clearly areas here that are being identified as positive areas where growth will be experienced. We had a look at it by looking at the risk and reward. So the more difficult something is to address, the more you've got to roll out expensive network, the more you've got to develop new technology and new processes and systems, the harder it is to do. The level of market extension required is another issue, because you have a situation where if it's a long way from connectivity, then why is the network operator involved? And so there's a temptation to minimize risk by going down into the sort of bottom left segment here, and the fixed wireless access has been identified as a big sort of early 5G opportunity, because the mobile companies will be able to go in and compete with the existing fixed line broadband providers in SME and residential marketplaces. And that's true. The only problem with that is that by competing in those markets, what's actually happening is the number of players is going up, the amount of competition is going up, the number of alternatives for the consumer is going up, which will presumably mean that the consumer will exercise that choice to leverage lower prices. And so there's no overall expansion of the industry, but in fact a further destruction of value, which is not a good way to pay for your expensive 5G network rollout. Now, all of these positions are sort of estimates here, so we may move these around as time goes on. There are things that require you to have 5G, if you like, but unfortunately the indicators for 5G go off in perpendicular directions. So you've got extremely high bandwidth capability with 5G. You've got the possibility of delivering very high reliability with low latency, and you've got the opportunity to have vast numbers of high density concurrent users, but they're all going off in a different direction. So providing a solution that fills that whole cube is going to be ruinously expensive, very, very difficult and or expensive, and possibly impossible to cover all the bases. So we have to ask ourselves then, what do you do if you can't provide a ubiquitous solution? So 5G Americas, for example, provided a model which is much more sort of granular approach and clusters of functionality where opportunity exists. So they've classified it as human to human, human to machine, machine to machine, and then you've got down the other side here, extreme mobile broadband, massive communications, ultra reliable, low latency. And so if you use those axes, you find that point solutions and a more granular approach where you might say, okay, here's an opportunity area. So that's quite a useful way of looking at it in a more addressable way. As an overall approach to things, we think that the network operator community needs to really take an approach that's based on the level of risk and reward. So if you have high risk but high reward, then it's worthwhile getting involved with other people who are and bringing your network expertise to the table, not necessarily as the leader, and then not necessarily taking the whole risk or underwriting the risk. If the risk or if the market is closer to what you are used to doing, so it's connectivity based, then the opportunity to lead those initiatives goes up. And if the difficulty of addressing means that the risk involved is lower, again, because you don't need so much expensive infrastructure. So if you were looking at massive IoT, for example, where the infrastructure is relatively cheap compared to some of the other stuff out there, then you might find that you could lead partnerships, again, because the risk would be at an acceptable level. But if you look at an opportunity area and you put it on this matrix, then it would be a useful way of saying, should we be in charge here? Should we be following someone else? Should we be driving it? Should we be taking the risk, or should we be laying that risk off amongst other players? So those are some approaches to sort of thinking about it. And then in the last couple of slides, just really some summaries from the reports that have already been published. And we feel quite strongly that at this time, we don't believe that a blanket approach to 5G rollout is either possible or desirable. Some of the, which I skimmed over very quickly, but some of the expense calculations from some of the analysts and telcos saying that it's going to cost $300 billion to roll out a 5G network in the US, for example, reckon that that's going to be a sort of hugely expensive network ubiquitously deployed over the whole of the US. Well, that's not going to be required, and that's not really where the opportunity exists. It needs to be a much more granular approach that a few key words that come from this slide are in the first bullet point there: improving end user experience. So if you can improve the end user experience, then you're doing a good job, and that will result in business benefit. You need to be talking with regulators and governments to develop a common view of expectations, because if you have some sort of universal service obligation, that means you've got to deploy network across the whole of the nation, and most of it is going to go unused because 4G is adequate in most cases, then that's going to be a lot of investment that you're not going to get a return on. So we believe that the approach is to have 5G islands addressing point solutions, and also to be aware that if you're competing with other telco types, so the fixed wireless access solution, for example, will not expand the sector and could actually leave the OTT service providers in a better position to compete in a market where you're getting less revenue per bit than you were before. So any functionality that is going to be telco-led needs to be related to connectivity. So 5G applications where the connectivity area is to the fore is going to be useful. So targeted and incremental, that's our bottom line, if you like, approach to 5G. And there are ways and means of doing that. And again, from experience of how operators have handled previous technology revolutions, the approach is probably better to go for a small independent part of the, or quasi-independent part of the company, and a unit that actually looks for, identifies and promotes and develops 5G solutions, and can operate with relative freedom and not have to drag the whole of the organization with it. Not only would that make it very cumbersome, but it again would tend to take you towards the very, very high expense way of doing things. So identify and tackle point solutions that are connectivity related, adjacent. These are, for example, e-health seems to me to be a good example of a place where the communication and the distribution of health solutions between carers and the cared for, and taking solutions out of hospitals and clinics and into the home. There's a very high communications element there, and the telcos could have a clear and obvious and beneficial role in that, and would be legitimately leading initiatives in those areas. But taking these point solutions together and developing them into an overall building and nurturing of an ecosystem, a 5G ecosystem, if you like, so that 5G is the natural, naturally owned by the telco operators. It is, after all, a network, but it is a platform. So building that platform as a place where other players can get in and play and develop business value and so on and so forth, but not by trying to invent the whole thing in one big go, but by taking point solutions and bringing along partners with expertise in the application area and the technology and so on. And then that, I think, will give us a route to 5G that will result in not bankrupting operators, whereas trying to roll out an entirely sort of gigabit network across a continent is a recipe for disaster. So that's pretty much all I've got to say. As I said, most of this stuff is based on the 2 reports that are on the Maximising Wireless Profit site. Feel free to have a look and engage with us and send us emails and chat to us, and we'll very happily talk to you about any aspects of this and answer any questions and discuss any business opportunities you might wish to discuss. But with that, I shall bid you a fond farewell and hope to see you on one of these again sometime soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.